18 elements here, with the giant dripstone stalagmites, glowberries, spore blossoms, and more. This is the ultimate lush cave to start our epic transformation in. Now first and foremost, let's start with our giant dwarf statue, since this vast cave is their home, and they were the ones to establish the epic lush ancient city we're going to be tackling today. Little is known about the origins of the dwarves, but they were outcast by those inhabiting the surface, leading them to seek sanctuary underground. It was a long time before the dwarves made contact with the surface dwellers again, but when they did, the kindness of the Jungle King led them to a strong alliance, which eventually led to the inter-biome mining network forming. Without the dwarves, the surface biomes would have struggled to prosper as they have, so it's fitting that this dwarf statue feeds the cave with its only lava source, essential for the smelting of materials mined from the cave network. To finalise our grand dwarf statue, I incorporated plenty of deep slate variations to tie in with the deep dark theme, which will become much more apparent when we tackle the rest of the city. I also gave the dwarfs some weapons, which actually represent one of the two factions of the city, which we'll explore more later on. The Copper faction was known as the fiercer faction of the dwarves, renowned for their resilience and survival abilities. To honour the sacrifices they made to protect the entire dwarven race, the Amethyst faction, who are the more innovative of the dwarves, built this statue bearing two weapons said to be wielded by the Copper faction's eldest ancestors. I think he makes for an awesome centrepiece of the forge area. With our dwarf statue complete, it's time to set it in place and get started on the next statues. If you've been following the Trixyblox channel for a while, you might remember my underground kingdom. This mega build was my first major project, and I really wanted to include some sort of reference to it in these caves. So I took the Atlas inspired statue I created for the underground kingdom and improved on it, to act as the basis for our founder statues. As you can see, the two statues look pretty different to each other, and I definitely think the new one is a major improvement. Using the foundations we just built, I added the finer details to the Jungle King statue. The Jungle King was also key to the creation of this inter-biome mining network, so he sits between the dwarf statue and the other statues, since it was his diplomacy that bridged the gap between the dwarves and the people inhabiting the surface. With the Jungle King statue complete, I place him down in front of the dwarf statue before moving on to our final two founder statues. To meet the lava channels that we're going to be placing, these statues need to be a little lower, so I tweaked the same underground kingdom statue into a kneeling position before getting started with the finer details. Then, to tackle the pharaoh statue, I built his headdress and added some clothing and jewellery to set him apart from the other statues. You may have also noticed the gemstones I have placed in the head of each statue, which is just a little representation of their home biomes. And for the Wolf Tribe Chief, I tried my best to recreate a feather war bonnet, which was pretty tricky using just Minecraft blocks on this scale, but I think it turned out looking pretty cool. And with the final Founders statues complete, it's time to incorporate them into the smelting area of the forge. As you can see, our Jungle King is supporting the main lava channel, which sloped down into the back of our Wolf Tribe Chief and Pharaoh statues. Now, whilst I really wanted this part of the build to be a crazy centerpiece that does the USW's lore some justice, I also wanted to make sure that it made some sense as a practical element of the build. So the front statues are each feeding a large basin of lava that they carry, which heats a vat attached above it. This way, all of the gold mined from the cave networks can be brought here and smelted, before transporting to the main forge. But we'll tackle all of those logistical elements later. These huge statues were a great way to kick off this cave upgrade, and I love how they tie the lore of the ultimate survival world into this transformation. Before completing the forge area, we need to lay out the city entrance and the city itself. To mirror the thin corridors and multi-leveled elements in the vanilla ancient city, I created these narrow staircases to connect the upper and lower platforms of the entrance and trading area, adding some basic crenellations to start off with. I then started to work on the first of the 3 biome entrances with a chain and cog system to work the doors. Well, we'll use our imagination and pretend that they work the doors. I played with the gear design for a while before settling on a style and embedding it in the wall either side of the entrance. As you may have guessed, this is the door to the desert. So I created the door in a style inspired by the USW's desert to keep things nice and themed, before adding the same theme to the inside of the door, as I really wanted it to feel like you're heading to another realm when you exit through these doors, since they do actually lead all the way to the biome that they're themed on. Yes, these doors literally connect these biomes with long, winding tunnels. So to continue the themed doors, I made some adjustments to the upper entrances, before adding an entrance themed around the Mesa's Wolf Tribe, and of course the final entrance was themed around the jungle, leading straight into the ancient jungle city. To tie things in nicely with the cave, I created a curved wall design before spending a long time decorating the back walls and floors in a typical dwarven style, as well as adding some soulfire lighting to tie in with the 1.19 theme, as these are going to be a key part of 1.19's ancient cities. With the main shell of the entrance and market area almost complete, I connect it up to what will later be the main forge area with a dwarven bridge, before making the final tweaks to the front wall. I think you guys will be excited for what I have planned for these archway designs later on. Finally, I made some final tweaks to the finer details of the walls and floor designs, before getting started with the market, starting off with some wool that I use for planning. I plotted out a marketplace, building a range of different market stalls using warped materials to tie in with the colour scheme. I then replaced some of the warped blocks with the new sculk sensors, which of course we're going to need for our deep dark cave. They also serve an important purpose to our dwarves, which we'll find out about later on. Now this entrance and trading area is the perfect place to gather supplies for a long adventure into the caves. Once you see the scale of what's coming, you'll definitely want to be geared up. Before we revisit our forge area and with our entrance complete, it's time to head over to begin the city, which will line the walls of the cave. I connected the city's foundations to the main forge area, before adding the main staircases to connect the different levels to one another. Since this city was going to connect and interact with the main forge area, I decided to get it all plotted out with wool in advance, so I knew exactly what space I was working with and how everything was going to link together, because I really wanted to make sure that the system made logical sense. I then continued my wall plan across the foundations of our city, incorporating plans for the factions' banners and relics, as well as plotting out paths for the water channels throughout the city. And to kick things off, I began with the bottom level of the city. In our dwarves' culture, they actually didn't have a typical class system. Instead, the younger dwarves inhabited the lower city, working hard and providing for their people, working their way up the tiers with age, until eventually making it to the elders' dwellings, studying the ancient dwarven texts. Also, you may have gathered that this is the Amethyst faction from the current rooftop designs. However, this didn't quite feel right, so I switched to our warped skulk rooftops to match the market and the 1.19 theme of this build. We'll still be including different details to set apart the two factions, which you'll see shortly. Now to tackle the middle layer of our deep dark city, I added some slightly larger buildings, since the dwarves gain more luxury as they work their way up the city. I also switched the main building materials as well, and I think it's really starting to look like a deep dark city now. And to make way for the top tier of the city, I made some final tweaks to the arching roof supports, ready for our final additions. Now, as I mentioned earlier, these dwarves have their very own library of ancient texts, which sits at the very top of their city. Generations of elders have studied these texts, even discovering ways to protect their city from the miners from the surface. The dwarves couldn't live with such a threat after their historical conflicts with the surface dwellers. Despite the serious reading that goes on in this library, it looks like a pretty cozy place to get lost in a good book. And of course, I had to add the elders' dwellings at the end of the top tier, taking inspiration from that classic Erebor style of building from The Hobbit. To finish up the city, I built the water channels we plotted out earlier with wool, and then mirrored the city to the other side, joining them to the entrance and trading area with more bridges. Now you'll remember me mentioning the two factions of dwarves, and you may have guessed that each faction inhabits one side of the city, depending on their strengths. They're very much seen as equal, but different, so their cities reflect this. Neither faction is inferior to the other. The Amethyst faction is based around innovation and creation, known for their extraordinary abilities to find valuable materials and use them to construct magnificent designs. The Copper faction is based around survival, known for their fierce fighting style and their sharp, savvy approach to surviving, affording them the greatest endurance no matter the odds. The factions each have two key relics representing their core values. The Amethyst faction has a pickaxe and a shovel, mirroring their roles in mining and creating, whilst the Copper faction has an axe and a sword, representing their survivalist abilities. And of course they keep the copper hammer of their ancestors in their banner. Whilst they've found more efficient fighting tools to use themselves, they still honour their heritage with this symbol. This deep dark dwarven city is insane, and we're not even finished up yet. And with the main city complete, it's time to finally start linking things up to the main forge. As you can see, we're adding a cave entrance at the edge of the city and finally getting started on those hanging conveyors. Now that I'm finally transforming this wool, you can see that I've incorporated these pouring towers where the conveyor buckets tip the mined materials, which you can see is gold in this case, into the smelting pots. These hanging conveyors work their way around the entire network of caves in a looped system, so that the dwarves and the other interbiome miners can keep the smelters operating virtually non-stop with an endless supply of gold. And finally, we're back at the forge area, creating our main base for weapon and tool creation. Once the materials have been smelted at the founder's smelting area, the liquid is poured into buckets and transported across the water to this forge. The pouring towers then transfer the liquid into these new vats, which keep the liquid heated with fires kept roaring by the bellows that you can see next to them. The liquids can then be poured into molds and forged into weapons on the forging tables, where the dwarves beaver away to create the most powerful tools and weapons of the USW. This is possibly one of my favourite parts of the build so far. I had to tackle things in a bit of a strange order to plot everything out properly, but it was definitely all worth it to see the forge up and running, linking so seamlessly with the rest of the elements in the cave. And of course, the dwarves need a place for fishing and transporting supplies, so I added in some docks at the bottom of the two sides of the city and dot around some boats carrying some materials. Since Amethyst Geodes are a 1.18 addition to the game, and one of our factions is named after it, I had to add in my own Amethyst Geodes at the back of the cave, as well as a bunch of cave entrances and platforms to start our cave network. The caves wind through this back wall, creating an intricate mine network full of epic loot and materials, including copper of course, since we can't leave out the copper faction either. Honestly, these caves took forever to map out, but they're going to be great fun to explore, especially once we've added in the minecart system. And if you've been keeping up with the mini-movie series on the Trixyblox channel, you guys will recognise this Emerald Cave from the Desert chapter, where many friendships are born and even a plot to overthrow the Pharaoh was hatched. And of course, I haven't forgotten about the Warden. In fact, the dwarves had many a battle with the Wardens of the Deep Dark when searching for a home safe beneath the surface. When they settled here and expanded this cave, they used sculpt materials on their rooftops to alert them of trespassers entering their city. These materials were stolen from the Wardens, who had become the dwarves' greatest enemy, eventually striking an attack on the city. The Copper faction defended the city from harm, and the dwarves were victorious, locking the Wardens away in these dungeons across the city. The Wardens now act as guards to the dwarves' most valuable treasure collections. We thought this would be an epic way to incorporate the Wardens into this transformation, giving you guys mini bosses to tackle in your adventures, and also doubling up as a mini upgrade for Minecraft's dungeons too. Will you tackle the Wardens head to head, or will you take the stealthy approach? And lastly, to finish the caves, I tweaked the vines to make sure that none were broken, and added some giant hanging lanterns based on the design I used in my Underground Kingdom build. I then tweaked the number of glowberry vines until I was happy with them, before finishing up with a crazy network of working minecarts, connecting the forge to the whole cave network and spanning across the entire back wall of the cave. So, with that, let's take a look at the Ultimate Survival World's new upgraded caves.